Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Give me 1 second. I am so excited to welcome Jeff Kripal tonight. He is the J. Newton Rayzor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University. And he also just started a new podcast for the humanities called Connections, Humanizing the Humanities, which my colleague Alexa will share in the link. Just a few housekeeping tips, as we always have to do in this new Zoom world. My colleagues Alexa and Amanda will be monitoring the chats and Q&A throughout Jeff's talk. For any questions you might want me to ask him at the end. And then there's also going to be a survey at the end that I would love for y'all to do. It's super quick and it helps us make sure these events are exactly what you want them to be and just super interesting. So I have to start with this one little thing that happened this morning with Jeff. I got an email from him and he said, "Kate, please don't do a formal introduction." And I said, "Okay, don't worry, I won't." I was just going to talk about how I was a religious studies major and how I was super excited you were here. And he's like, "That's great. That's perfect," because there are so many misconceptions about what studying religion is and what it means. And he goes, "I bet so many people have thought that you were studying to be a nun." And I said, "Jeff, that's exactly it. I can't tell you how many plane rides I've been on where I've said, 'Oh, I'm a religious studies major.' And people are like, 'Oh, well, like, where's your little outfit?' Or like, 'Are you a nun?'" And within 5 minutes, he had sent me a screenshot of an excerpt from a book he had written about what his fantasy plane ride conversation would be with someone who did not understand what studying religious studies was. And I know I promised that I would not embarrass you, Jeff, but I have to read this excerpt because there are so many religious studies alums and students here. And this just really resonated with me and I feel like will resonate with us. You said, "I compare fantastic states of mind and energy in order to catch a glimpse of our own supernature, of our own supernatural world." So I am so excited to have you here to talk about your book, The Flip. And as always, I appreciate your words, I appreciate your mind, and I appreciate you so much for joining us tonight. So take it away.
Kate. Thanks, Kate. I'm glad you didn't become a nun. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. So there are lots of people in this room. I can't see any of them. That's okay. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, get about how long Kate asked me to talk. And then I'm hoping we can have a conversation after that based on the questions. So I've done a lot of these things, as you might imagine. And one of the things I've learned over the years is that if I just tell my story, tell listeners something about how I came to this strange discipline called the study of religion, it makes a lot of sense of what I do. If I can embed the ideas in a narrative or a story, they make sense. If I just present them to you abstractly outside that life or outside that humanity, they actually don't make a lot of sense. And so I'd like to do that. I'd like to spend just a few minutes kind of telling you a bit about how I got here, how I came to Rice, and what I do today in the School of the Humanities and why I'm so passionate about the humanities and what I think they're about and how I think they might interact with the sciences or the STEM fields, which is really the topic of the book tonight that we're talking about. So I grew up north of here, almost exactly 800 miles north of here in southeastern Nebraska. I grew up in a very small German farming community. The notion of cultural and religious difference in this little town was basically whether you were a Lutheran or a Catholic. Everybody was German and everybody was pretty similar. When I was a young man, I became extremely pious for reasons I won't get into here. I actually did not want to become a nun, but I did want to become a monk, Kate. So I kind of fit the stereotype. And I went to a Catholic seminary to essentially become a monk. And that didn't work out for a variety of reasons, but I got an amazing education from these monks who were steeped in the whole history of European Christian philosophy and theology and literature. But what I got really interested in was the comparative study of religion. I became fascinated with why people are religiously so different, and yet how we can recognize religion pretty much everywhere, anywhere we go as religious. So what is it that's the same and what is it that's different? That was really kind of the driving question that took me to graduate school at the University of Chicago from 1985 to 1993. And then I taught at a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania called Westminster College for 9 years. And I arrived here at Rice in 2002. So that's sort of my life story and how I came to the study of religion. I want to talk now a bit about what the study of religion is, and then what the humanities are, and then I want to talk a bit about the flip and what this particular book is about. I was trained in a field called history of religions. It's essentially what most people think of as comparative religion. The history of religions is concerned about understanding religious experience in any culture at any time. And it attempts to develop comparative cross-cultural models of how that religious experience works and how we might interpret it. It's very close to what most people would think of as anthropology, but it also is close to philosophy and literature. So it combines a lot of fields. I often joke there is no such discipline that we might call religion. Religion is a kind of intellectual promiscuity. It draws from wherever it can to understand its topic or its object, which is religious experience. And what a lot of people, I think, misunderstand about the field that Kate and I were joking about this morning is it's not my job to affirm or support anyone's religious worldview. But neither is it my job to deny anyone's religious worldview. My job is to understand why people are religious and what role or function these belief systems and ritual systems play in people's lives across the globe. And that's a really important clause there, across the globe. So more particularly, I study what I would call extreme religious experiences. I'm not really interested in why people go to synagogue or church or temple. I'm interested in what happens to individual human beings when something really weird or really strange or really exotic happens to them. And that they then interpret what happened to them in religious ways. And of course, they don't always do that, but they often do. And I'll give you a few examples in a moment. Well, I'll give you a couple examples right now. One of the books I co-wrote a few years ago is called Changed in a Flash. And I wrote it with a woman here in Houston named Elizabeth Crone, who's a member of the synagogue across the street from Rice, called Congregation Emmanuel. And in 1988, Elizabeth was attending the yard site or the anniversary of her grandfather's death. And she got out of her car in the parking lot across the street there with her 2-year-old and 4-year-old little boys and was struck by lightning. And she immediately had this really dramatic near-death experience that I won't get into here, but it involved a lot of very elaborate visionary landscapes, a lot of knowledge of things that were going to happen in the next year, and really reoriented her entire life. And it had a very interesting connection to her Judaism. In many ways, it couldn't be fit in to the particular form of Judaism that she practiced, kind of reform or liberal Judaism. it fit in very well to some forms of conservative or Orthodox Judaism, but she herself did not align with those forms. So it kind of left her in this really interesting place. And so the book is about her experience. She actually writes the first half of the book, and then I write the second half of the book. So those are the kinds of things I'm really interested in, is how these extreme experiences change people, in this case in a flash, but also how they don't fit in, how people struggle with this disconnect or this cognitive dissonance between what they experienced or know now and what their broader community or culture knows or says. And it's that disconnect that I'm really interested in. Elizabeth, for example, did not speak about her experience for almost 30 years because she was so afraid of what people would say and how her children would be treated at school. The flip actually begins with a similar set of experiences from a man you probably have heard of named Mark Twain. Twain was actually incredibly gifted and often had dreams of things that would play out in the future. And these dreams often played out in great detail. And the dream I begin the book with is one night he dreamed of his brother Henry's funeral. And this dream was so real that he actually got up after the dream and was going to walk to the morgue to see the body until he realized it was just a dream. Henry was not dead at all. He was quite alive. But Henry was killed in a boiler accident a couple weeks later, and the exact scene of Twain's dream then played out. So these are the kinds of things that fascinate me. And what's interesting about Twain's dream is that, like Elizabeth, he didn't want to talk about it or claim this experience in public. He was a very famous writer at this point. And he wrote a series of essays on these kinds of experiences, wanted to publish them with Harper's Weekly, but wanted Harper's Weekly to publish them anonymously, which of course they wouldn't do. And then he eventually did publish them. And so again, it's that question of when people have these extraordinary experiences and when they don't fit into their cultural surround or their community, and how they struggle with them, that really, I think, it interests me the most. I did not always write about these things, nor was I interested in them. I spent the first 20 years of my career really writing about sexuality and religion, and in particular male sexuality and religion, which we can talk about later, but isn't quite relevant here. About 20 years ago, I got very interested in these topics because I was working on a history of the American counterculture out in California. And I was working with a lot of people who were telling me stories that I knew couldn't have possibly happened, but I also knew they happened. And I became very puzzled by this because I had been trained, like I think most intellectuals are trained in the humanities, to dismiss all stories of remarkable things as somehow legendary, or perhaps as exaggerations, or in some cases is simply made up to accrue authority or power or something. And that was the worldview I just accepted. I didn't really think about it, to be honest, until these people began telling me these stories, and I realized that actually they were not after any kind of power or authority. They were as troubled by these stories as anybody would have been, and that they were doing their very best to tell me the truth of what happened to them. And so I got fascinated by this, and I was in particular fascinated by how my own field, in this case the study of religion, had ignored or sidelined something that was clearly at the core of religion, the remarkable, the miraculous, the uncanny, and how it had refused really to talk about it. So I wrote actually a history of the paranormal, which came out in 2010, called Authors of the Impossible. And what I learned researching and writing that book is that the paranormal, like the psychical, did not actually originate in the tabloids or in popular culture. these categories were all coined by scientists in the late 19th and early 20th century. And they did not mean the supernatural. They referred to capacities or phenomena that occur around human beings and which are part of the natural world, but for which we have no scientific models or theories yet. So the paranormal simply means to the side of the normal. It was coined in French as paranormal in 1903, and it really simply meant something we don't understand yet, but that is quite real. It was obvious to these researchers these things happen. It was obvious to me researching this book that these things happen, and I was really curious why we no longer had any ways of talking about them. So I sort of made it my business to talk about them and to help intellectuals access their own intellectual lineages, their own intellectual currents for tools and ways of talking about these things that make them comfortable. And what I learned traveling really around the country and Europe mostly for about 15 years lecturing on these things is that most intellectuals in the humanities, and often in the sciences as well, I should add, are in the closet on this one. They know darn well that these things happen. They know darn well that they're part of our world. And yet they also know that if they talked about them, their authority or their privilege or their establishment in society might be questioned, or perhaps even their sanity. And so again, you have this pattern of not being able to talk about something that really is extremely important to talk about, particularly when you're trying to understand religion, which I would argue is all about these extraordinary states of mind and energy. In 2014, I became quite concerned about the humanities actually, and their relationship to the sciences and how we might understand the humanities in relationship to the sciences and how we can put them into deeper conversation. And so I wrote a kind of manifesto that the Chronicle of Higher Education published in 2014 called Visions of the Impossible, which you can still go online and read. And the essential argument of that little manifesto was that the sciences are so powerful and so effective because they take this third person objective point of view and they study the material world in ways that are replicable and measurable and in many cases quantifiable. Math or mathematics is the kind of lingua franca of the sciences, but it's very much a third person kind of abstract view of the world. Whereas the humanities take what I would call a subjective or first person view and are looking at human experience that's been encoded in some kind of cultural artifact, say a text or a piece of art or a building or what have you. But the humanities are very much after this kind of subjective element, this kind of inner world that we all live in and we're all, I assume, living in right now. And the challenge became, how do we put those two together? How do we take this third person scientific view of the world, which actually in some ways has no place for us, cannot really explain consciousness or subjectivity, and how do we combine that with this first person humanistic view of reality, which can understand and get inside the subjectivity, but clearly is not scientific in the way the sciences are. And that was really the punch or the focus of that essay. And I argued that one of the ways we could do that is to turn to these extraordinary experiences, which inevitably combine the subjective and the objective in really baffling ways that just completely throw into disorder our normal ways of thinking about the sciences and the humanities and carving them up into these departments and into these universities or colleges. So that essay came out in 2014 and it got a great deal of reaction, most of it positive, some of it not so positive. But one of the people who reacted to it very strongly and very positively was a woman named Erica Goldman, who happened to be the editor at a press called Bellevue Literary Press in New York City. And Bellevue Literary Press is a really interesting press. It was founded by a medical doctor in Bellevue Hospital who became very concerned that the humanities and the sciences were no longer talking to one another, and that the sciences were kind of floating off from the humanities. And he wanted to found this press that would put them back into conversation. And Erica was actually very moved by my essay. She contacted my literary agent and asked to speak to me. And she then we spoke on the phone, and she said to me basically, look, I'm a very secular person. I'm very skeptical about these things you're writing about, but there was nothing in your essay I could disagree with. And I found that really fascinating. And would you consider expanding this essay into a book? And I, as I usually do, I naively said yes. And then I didn't do it. Because I had too many other things to do. And poor Erica was very generous with me and very patient. And she sort of kept contacting me and nudging me. And after 5 years, I finally wrote this little book for her, really, called The Flip. That came out in 2018. I guess it was 4 years. It took me 4 years. So The Flip, what's The Flip about? So, I teach at Rice, and obviously, most Rice students are STEM students, obviously. And I teach religion, which is a very weird topic for STEM students to take. And I realized quite quickly that I teach Really 101 now, or did. I don't anymore. I'm in the dean's office now, working in administration, but for about 12 years, I taught Really 101. And many of you, I think in this room, have probably taken Really 101. It's this sort of wild, grand opera of everything in religious studies. And when I first started teaching Really 101, I was, of course, using a lot of classic religious texts. And I realized something pretty quickly. I realized that young or future doctors and engineers and chemists didn't really think much of these religious people, that it was easy to dismiss them and not take their experiences seriously. And so I decided, it might be more effective to look at the extraordinary experiences of scientists and engineers and medical doctors. And so I began to collect all of these stories. And I also had been meeting with mostly quantum physicists and neuroscientists and historians of science for years at a place called the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. So I knew a lot of scientists. I'd spent literally months with them, sitting in the same room, listening to them talk about quantum physics, which is the craziest thing in the world, but also about neuroscience and the history of science. And so I knew how they thought, and I deeply respected them. And I knew that they had these experiences, and that they felt that these experiences were really at the core of what science would become in the future, not what it is now, not what it was in the past, but what it would become. And so I decided to write this book about these scientists and these engineers, and to show that these human beings have the same kinds of experiences as these crazy religious people did, but that they draw different meanings. They interpret it or upload them differently than our ancestors did. And what's so fascinating about this is these are essentially conversion stories that are very powerful in our own culture, because our own culture, of course, privileges science and engineering and medicine. And so when you have doctors and engineers and scientists telling you this, you inherently believe them in a way that you don't believe a religious person. And what was so interesting to me about what I called these flips, and by the flip, I mean, these are all professional intellectuals, and they were trained to think that there is only matter, that the world is material through and through, and that this matter is made of tiny bits of matter or tiny patterns of energy that are mathematically organized. And so mathematics and materialism really are the fundamental truth of the way things are. And mind or subjectivity, or what you're in right now, looking at me blabbing, is essentially an illusion. It's what they call an epiphenomenon. It's produced by the brain. And so when the brain stops and dies, there is no more consciousness. There is no more subjectivity. It just goes out like a light bulb. What happens to a scientist or engineer who has such a flip is that they realize that that's actually not true. In their minds now, consciousness is primary, and the material world is an expression or a dimension of this consciousness. Consciousness now becomes a kind of fundamental structure of the universe, like gravity or force. So one way to put this is that before the flip, these individuals believed, and it really is a belief, that mind is inside them, inside their skulls. It's right here. After this flip, they come to believe that actually they're in mind, that mind is everywhere, and that the brain is a very sophisticated, highly evolved biological organism that picks up this consciousness or subjectivity that already exists and translates it into, in our case, a human being, a person. And so the metaphor I always use here is actually your cell phone, which is a really common thing we all have. This old production model is basically the argument that the cell phone creates the internet, which of course it doesn't. The internet is actually what runs your cell phone, and that's the flip. So we're all essentially biological cell phones with these personal interfaces, and we imagine that our bodies are producing consciousness in full, but actually our bodies are essentially receiving or downloading or translating this broader consciousness into a more reduced form that we call Kate Coley or Jeff Kripal. So that's essentially the flip. I look at that flip in a number of prominent scientists, and I'll just list a couple of these, and then I want to shut up here soon so we can talk. The book actually treats a number of scientists, including Kary Mullis, whom I knew. Kary won the Nobel Prize in 1993 for chemistry. He invented the polymerase chain reaction, or what's called the PCR process, that made the Human Genome Project possible. And Kary was he passed away a few years ago. He was really a remarkable human being who had a most bizarre set of experiences on his California cabin property, actually, that his daughter also had independently of him. And he writes about these in his autobiography called Dancing Naked in the Minefield. And so I talked about Kary there. I also talked about Hans Berger, who invented what would become the EEG. A.J. Ayer, the famous atheist British philosopher. Eben Alexander, an American brain surgeon. Barbara Ehrenreich, a very famous social feminist critic, but a trained cell biologist as well. Marjorie Hines Wollicott, a neuroscientist. Wolfgang Pauli, the great quantum physicist. And Bernardo Kastrup, a contemporary Dutch computer scientist who is really quite remarkable writer, actually. And in each of these cases, I demonstrated that these individuals flipped at some point in their life. And I was really interested in kind of what that means for us in the humanities and how we can think about that with our own tools. So Kate and Alexa and Amanda, I'm thinking maybe I should shut up now and see where we're at with questions. I feel like I'm just talking to the wall here because there are no people in here. I know there are people in here, but I don't quite believe that. So.
I know. It's a weird situation.
Yeah.
Okay, so I actually personally, I'm going to be selfish and take over the first few questions just because I'm interested. And again, to everyone who's here, if you have not read the flip, it's very good. Jeff calls it an easy read. He says you can do it in a day. It took me 3 days, so like no judgment though.
I have to say that though.
But it is like a book to read that is easier to read than a lot of academic books. So I appreciate you putting that out there. Something that I was really interested in that you talked about was this idea of the foretaste of evolutionary knowledge, like this idea that us coming together, the humanities and the sciences being able to work together in this new world, and that a lot of past ideas are still fine, but have not really, they don't make as much sense today for what we have now understood within the science realm, and kind of what you think that looks like.
Well, so again, I mean, this is a book about scientists. The sciences, of course, as scientists know, are becoming stranger and stranger. I mean, you don't have to hang around long with quantum physicists to realize that A, either they're crazy, or B, that material reality is extremely weird. And we just didn't know that 150 years ago. We assumed a kind of simple, kind of atomistic, kind of physical universe that just doesn't exist anymore, you know, on that kind of quantum level. And that's just one example where I think our sciences are becoming so sophisticated and so complex that a lot of things we assumed to be true 100, 150 years ago simply can no longer be held. And Kate, by the way, this historians of science refer to something called presentism. And presentism is the position of a lot of people who actually don't do science or don't know science. And it essentially says that whatever the sciences say in the present is the final truth. And of course, what scientists know, and certainly what historians of science know, is that's nonsense. That's never the case. What we know today is not what we will know, 20 years from now, much less 100 years. So and I think what's so important about a lot of these developments is that the sciences are realizing that there is no science without human subjectivity. I mean, one of the things I like to say to be provocative is that actually the sciences are just a division of the humanities. And what I mean by that is there are no sciences without human beings. It's the human mind that does the math and does the science. And that's a very, at the end of the day, mysterious process. Why does this abstract thing called mathematics, which we just make up in our heads, why does it turn out to reflect so closely material reality? And we can send men to the moon and back with it. And we just made it up in our heads. I mean, that's extremely strange. And this gets into all kinds of debates that take us back to Plato and Aristotle. But that's what I mean about the future, is I think we need a way of somehow bringing the human element together with the science.
For those who haven't read the book, the Aristotle Plato that you wrote about, like talking about comparing them and who we are, like that Aristotle has kind of taken over.
We're Aristotelians. Except for a lot of mathematicians, by the way. A lot of mathematicians are Platonists, but that's another side conversation. Yeah, we're mostly Aristotelians today.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned in your book the politics of knowledge, which I found very interesting, and we've gotten a few questions about. So I just wanted to hear your comments on that.
What are the questions, if I might ask, about the politics of knowledge?
It's mainly just to describe what your thoughts on the politics of knowledge are. And what exactly that means, especially within, I think, the academic world.
Yeah, so I'll start with a joke, but because I think it helps. So one of the things I'm often asked when I lecture at other universities is how I get away with this. In other words, how can I talk about such strange things and people invite me to talk about strange things. And I say, well, it's pretty easy. I mean, I'm a scholar of religion, which means I don't know anything. I'm not a physicist or a chemist who actually knows something in our culture. I'm a humanist, and that there's this hierarchy in the university of disciplines that are valued and receive a lot of, say, federal resources, and then there are disciplines that are not valued and do not receive resources. And something like physics or chemistry or biology is up here, and the social sciences are here, the humanities are here. The study of religion is underneath the ground or below the screen, But the lower you go in that hierarchy or politics of knowledge, the more freedom you have, and the more you can say. And the higher you go in that hierarchy of knowledge, I think the less freedom you have, and the less you can say. And the reason I believe that is, again, this book is about scientists. And what I've noticed with my scientific colleagues is that when they write about these extraordinary moments, they're virtually all retired. They will not write about these things while they have a career, trying to get grants.
You mentioned that in your book a lot of people don't want to say these things.
No, they do not want to say these things.
They'll be laughed out of the room.
Yeah. And so someone like me is already laughed out of the room because I'm a humanist. I'm a scholar of religion. Oh God, that's him saying those crazy things again. He doesn't know anything. Well, because I don't know anything, I can say anything, and I can think thoughts that other people can't think. And so, and it's not about me, it's about this politics of knowledge that I'm trying to get at, that sometimes new ideas come from the margins. They don't always come from the center. Sometimes they do, but often they come from the margins, and then they seep in and up.
Okay, we've got another one. Do you think biologists and, for instance, medical doctors are less susceptible to the flip than physicists, physical chemists, etc.?
Okay, so the person you need to talk to is Elaine Eklund. Go talk to Elaine. That is her question, actually. What do scientists really think? Not what do we think they think, but what do they really think? And Elaine spent her whole life studying that. To try to answer the question, I think medical doctors, my brother's a medical doctor. I know a lot of doctors. Of course, I have a lot of students who are doctors. It's tough, I mean, being a medical doctor is essentially being trained to treat the human being as a meat machine, as a biological machine, which of course it is. I mean, the body is that. And it's very hard for them to often consider these ideas because they're dealing on a daily basis with the fact that the human body is a biological machine, and they're correct about that. And so modern medicine can be very effective treating the body that way, but you're not treating the person. You see, there's a human being who's also that body, and this is why we're so committed to the medical humanities over in the School of Humanities, because if you can practice medicine in this broader kind of humanistic context, you can treat this person who's ill or suffering as a person and not just as a biological machine. But I will say this, one of the privileged loci for extraordinary religious experiences today is the modern hospital. And the reason is this. Take the near-death experience literature. The phrase near-death experience was coined in 1975. And virtually everything, and it was coined, by the way, by a PhD in philosophy who couldn't get a philosophy job, so he became a medical doctor named Raymond Moody. So he's like a frustrated philosopher who's I shouldn't speak for Raymond Moody, but he couldn't get an academic position, and so he became a doctor, which is probably not a bad idea. But so he coins this phrase, near-death experience, in 1975. And the reason it takes off and becomes part of our lexicon today is because of modern medicine. in modern biotechnology, and let me put it this way. I think human beings have always had near-death experiences. But historically, before modern technology and modern medicine, most people died. They didn't come back with their story. Okay, so by 1975, and certainly by 2020, we have ways of pulling people back out of the death process, and they're way down the tube, as it were, or way down the tunnel, or whatever your metaphor is. And then we pull them back, and they're like, holy crap, do you know what I saw? And then you boom, then you get this wild, crazy near-death experience story. Well, we wouldn't have got that before we pulled them back. It's just gone. So I think there's an intimate relationship between modern medicine and modern biotechnology and the development of these literatures like the near-death experience literature. And so I think doctors and nurses are kind of on the front lines of this, and they see this. They see people kind of wake up before they're dying, or they see loved ones interact with their dying loved one after they died in ways that are inexplicable. And inexplicable things are happening around death all the time, which often takes place in a hospital today. And if a doctor or a nurse or a medical professional has no capacity to imagine that, or to take that as a potential human experience, then I think they're hampered. I think that's a problem. It doesn't mean you have to believe what the believer means, or you have to believe what the family believes, but just to take that experience in and not dismiss it, I think is really, really important.
I totally agree. As I mentioned to you earlier today, my father had a near-death experience, and when I walked into the room afterwards, he was in the hospital, and the nurse actually pulled me aside, and she was like, I need to tell you what just happened. And she had this very real understanding of it, which made it this really amazing kind of moment, and normalized it in a way.
And I'll bet the doctor wouldn't have done that.
No, I never even met the doctor.
Yeah, but the nurse often will. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard so many stories. We could just talk all night about stories, and doctors who then flip.
Yeah.
You
know. Okay, we've got another question. Scientific revolutions typically take generations of science students who are flexible in thinking about new ideas. How should we engage the younger generation to engage and research the kinds of paranormal / extraordinary human experience, i.e., can we do experimental work to demonstrate that there is more to being human than the biochemistry here on Earth?
So that's a great question. So this is why I do what I do. This is why I try to do it in a university. I think if we're going to make any progress here, it has to get into the gut of higher education, and it has to become a part of how we train future doctors and engineers and physicists. I think historically these conversations have happened over here on the side, or they happen in the entertainment world or in science fiction or something, but they don't get into these elite institutions that could actually preserve them and develop them and turn them into something, I think, very serious. And so I think we have to integrate it into our higher educational systems would be my answer to that, because that's how you develop something and continue it over many generations. It can't just be some dingbat over in the Department of Religion at Rice University talking about these things. It has to be part of a discipline, part of a funded research project going on at multiple institutions in multiple countries, by the way. And I think this is where the sciences have it exactly right. They don't locate the science in any individual or institution. It's the larger global community that's really the science.
So after someone has undergone the flip, what wisdom might they bring to confront or help us deal with or view differently the climate crisis?
So, okay, so I was afraid you were going to ask me about COVID. I really have very little to say about.
Well, now we probably will, Jeff. Now
Okay,
you
so
put it
please,
out there.
I'll make something up. But so there's a real debate about whether these flips are relevant to environmental activism. And let me give you a really down to earth example. There is a young female environmental activist named Rachel Peterson, and you can go online tonight and read her essay. And Rachel is an activist. She's an environmental activist. She also suffers from a kind of clinical or depression that does not respond to the usual medications that serious depression does. And she volunteered for a psilocybin clinical trial at Johns Hopkins University. Johns Hopkins has been engaging in psilocybin research for a long time. Psilocybin is the active molecule in magic mushrooms. It's a highly psychoactive, extremely powerful molecule. And the researchers at Johns Hopkins have felt for decades now that it could be a very effective treatment of depression and PTSD, and can also help people who are dying of cancer to die better deaths. And what we know about psilocybin in clinical trials is, believe it or not, in 70 to 80% of the people who are given psilocybin, 70 to 80% flip. They have one of these drop your jaw religious experiences, and they come out of it completely changed. And this happened to Rachel. Rachel was a very, very depressed activist who happened to be an atheist, and she innocently took psilocybin to treat her depression, and she had an experience of the ground of all being. And she came out of this like, oh my God. I mean, literally, oh my God. And it then helps her think about her activism. But she's extremely critical of the idea that by just having one of these flips, you then care about the environment. Because for Rachel, the environmental crisis is not about an experience or an individual. It's about broad economic, financial, and cultural powers that are affecting this disaster, this slow train wreck, which we're looking at. Some people think that such flips could help the climate crisis in the sense that they could convince people that they're part of a larger whole. And this is what we mean by the ecological movement. It's when you stop thinking of yourself as an individual and you think of yourself as an organism within this broader organism called the Earth. And so some people believe, and I think with good reason, that such a flip can create that conviction. But I think it doesn't always work that way. I don't think you can just move from a flip or such an experience to a political or a moral or an ethical platform. I think that translation is a difficult one. And that's what I talk about in the Politics of Knowledge chapter, actually. I'm personally skeptical that it's that easy, because I study religion, and I know that religion has done some of the most beautiful things in human history, and it's done some of the most awful, violent, sinister things in human history. So just having a religious experience and being part of a religious community doesn't guarantee positive action. It can, but it also can go in the other way. And so I think we have to be really, really careful and critical about this.
Yeah, that reminds me of a great quote by you that I'm going to totally butcher, but I'll give you the idea and you'll remember what it is. It's something about good ideas being misused does not mean that they were a bad idea.
Yeah, the quote is, a badly used idea is not a bad idea. And every idea in human history that has survived has been used for bad purposes. It doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It just means you can use anything for bad purposes.
Okay, this is a long one, so bear with me. Can you speak to the gross underrepresentation of African Americans' life experiences, worldviews, and beliefs in academia? STEM research and writing roles may impact the beliefs and assumptions we hold within what is commonly accepted science-based mainstream US culture.
So I can speak to that. The Department of Religion at Rice has been very committed to African and African American religious history for decades. Elias Bongba and Tony Penn are there, and a lot of our graduate students are African American. I think, though, with the experiences I'm talking about now, a lot of African Americans would be very reluctant to talk about them because they're already marginalized or demeaned by the public culture. So to come out and start talking about the spiritualist or the magical dimensions of African American religious practice, or voodoo, for example, it's immediately going to be demonized by the public. And so I think that's why you see so little of this in the public area. I think the academy, I think the humanities in particular, have been moving in this direction for quite some time. Not fast enough, but certainly have been. I'll give you a concrete example. One of my former PhD students is a man named Stephen Finley, an African-American intellectual at LSU. And Stephen wrote his dissertation with Tony Penn on the Nation of Islam. And one of the chapters in it was on the Nation of Islam as essentially as a UFO religion. People don't know it, but the Nation of Islam features an extreme interest in what's called the mother wheel, which is essentially a UFO encounter that was central to a lot of different aspects of the Nation of Islam, and still is. And Stevens just had a really tough time getting people to listen to him, because that doesn't fit what people think, the African American religious experience should be. They think it's about the Christian churches, essentially. So I think there's challenges here, but I think the same kind of methods we use to understand and appreciate, anyone's religious experience, no matter how extraordinary or eccentric it is, we can use the same exact methods to look at African American religious experiences, and people are. I mean, my department's filled with those people. We're doing that right now.
That's great. Okay, if I am not mistaken, I feel like you have some sort of action figure or something in your office on Rice campus. So I feel like you might really vibe with this question.
Okay.
So
I have many action figures, by the way, probably more than I'm willing to admit.
I mean, yeah, I wouldn't say it here, but so what are your feelings on Marvel's Doctor Strange? Do you interpret his story arc as going through the flip?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to get too excited here because I actually love that movie, and I think the Doctor Strange narrative is wonderful. For those of you who haven't seen the movie, Stephen Strange is a surgeon. He's a very arrogant, very wealthy surgeon, and he gets into a car accident and he gets his hands severely injured, and it sends him into a spiritual crisis, and he goes to Tibet and he meets this Tibetan master who essentially flips him. If you saw the movie, that scene in the movie where she hits him and he knocks out of his physical body into a subtle body is a classic kind of portrayal of what I'm calling the flip. And then he learns the arts, as it were, the magical arts after that. But yeah, so I mean, I think Hollywood and I think the film industry, I think the reason, if you go to Netflix tonight and you scroll through the options, a half of them are going to be about paranormal or supernatural themes. And the reason is this: people have these experiences. They're fascinated by these things. But you can't talk about those things in any elite public space. You can't be a politician and talk about them. You can't be an academic and talk about them, although I am. You can't be a religious leader and talk about them. But you can make a movie about them. You can write a science fiction novel about them. You can make a television Netflix series about them, and you can get away with it because it's fiction, right? So that's the place in our culture now where people are playing with these experiences and these ideas, but in a way that allows them to disavow them. And that's interesting to me as a cultural historian. That kind of safety net. Oh, I'm just telling you a story. Well, often, trust me, they're not just telling you a story. They're putting their own experience in the novel or in the film. These people write me. I mean, I have filmmakers and novelists write me all the time, and they're like, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Can you tell me what to do here? I mean, they've been flipped, and they're trying to figure out how to do this, you know.
It's very interesting. I mean, kind of in that same realm, we've got
It's Iron Man, by the way. It was an Iron Man bus.
Oh, yes. Ugh, so ashamed I didn't know that. There was someone listened to a podcast that you were on, and you joyfully called humans mutants.
Yeah.
Relate humans to X-Men in a way of like, what we have not reached this level of like what we're capable of.
Right.
So can you, like, I would just love to hear you say more about that.
So my favorite Marvel mythology is the X-Men. And the reason is the key figure is a professor, Professor Xavier or Professor X. And the basic myth is that Professor Xavier is this academic who founds this secret school in Westchester County, north of New York City. And it's for young people who have some special capacity, some special gift. They can see into the future, or they can leave their bodies, or they can do all sorts of extraordinary things. And their families often reject them, and their communities reject them. And he accepts them, and he brings them into the school, and he teaches them how to A, accept their gifts, and B, how to use these gifts. And he understands these gifts as essentially evolutionary buds. These are aspects of life that are trying to manifest, trying to express themselves, but are getting crushed by the public culture. And one of the reason I love that myth so much is it's not a myth, actually. When I write about these things, or when I talk about these things in public, always, and I mean always, somebody will take me to dinner after the lecture, or they'll write me after the book, and they'll say to me, hey, I have a story. And then they tell me some ridiculously impossible thing that happened to them, and it really happened to them, or they really had a dream that played out the next day, and they've never heard anybody say in public that happens all the time. They just thought they were a freak, basically. And so there's this guy telling them that, oh yeah, that happens all the time. And suddenly they're like, oh, I feel better. I wonder what he'll say about this. And so I think that's what higher education can be at its best. It can accept young people for their gifts, even if those gifts don't fit in to their own communities and public cultures. And it's not that we know how to use those gifts or we have some omniscience, we don't, but just that expression of acceptance and the ability to listen and to take seriously, I think is really quite freeing and healing, actually, for people. And so that's what I mean when I say the X-Men are real and human beings are mutants. And of course we are mutants. I mean, that's how evolution happens. And so that's the explanation.
Well, that was our last question for the night. I'm telling you, there are still like so many more people have so many questions. So I'm sure we're going to have you back as a guest very soon. But thank you so much for joining us. This has been such an amazing event. I want to give a shout out to Virtue Owl Connections. If you're looking for more events like this, definitely make sure you check us out. Alexa will share in the chat the link. And again, Jeffrey Kripal, I'm telling you, guys, check out this book. It is so good. It is amazing. So again, thank you, Jeff, for joining
Thank you.
us.
Thank you, Kate and Alexa and Amanda. Thank you for doing this. And I'd love to come back.
I mean, well, now you have to. So
Yeah.
perfect. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And thank you everyone for joining us. Please participate in the survey in the end, as I mentioned, and we will see you next time.
How often do you do these, Kate?
About monthly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, my dream is just to have you on a podcast, though.
You know, I do podcasts. I mean, there's a lot of those out there.
I know, but I know we gotta combine our podcast skills. I talked to John about this.
We can have a mutant podcast.
Yes, perfect.
There are some great podcasts out there, though. People often tell me I should do a podcast. And I'm like, really? I don't know. There's so many good ones. I just like.
You know, you're very talented at podcasts, and I mean, participants are still listening, but I'll still say this in front of you. And that's what I said before. You're just very generous with who you are, and you're someone who is actually very interested in people. You don't have a thought on what's right and wrong. You want to continue to learn from people, and I think that's what makes you so amazing, especially for things around podcasts. You truly are a lifelong learner, and you want to continue to learn.
Yeah. I hope so. I mean, this mutant question you asked, I mean, it's really fascinating to read these emails. I mean, I get them every week, and they're really extraordinary. And it's really given me a kind of straight line into this kind of secret. And it's not secret in some kind of creepy way. It's secret in the sense that people don't talk about it.
Yeah.
But when they tell you, wow, they really tell you, they just kind of spill their heart because nobody else, they don't think anybody else will listen. I'll tell you a story here. It's really, I kind of cry whenever I tell it, so I'll try not to cry. But one time I was in my office, this was 10 years ago, and a woman from New York called me, and she's an artist, and she was in California at some kind of art fair selling her art. And her husband and her were driving across the whole country from California to New York. And she asked me if I would sit down with her for 1 hour. She just wanted 1 hour. And I said, well, how are you going to get here? And she says, well, we're going to drive through Houston. I was like, oh my God. Okay, sure, I'll do that. So this woman shows up in my office. She's probably 60, 65, and her husband doesn't come in. He's sitting in the car waiting outside. And she proceeds to tell me this story about their young daughter who was one of these people who was super addictive. She was just addicted to everything instantly. And she died. She died of an overdose at like 24 or 25, a really, really young woman.
Yeah.
And the family got together for a wake in the home, which was this 2-story house. And during the wake, the phone started to ring on both floors, and people picked the phone up, and it was the dead daughter. Wow. And the daughter said, Daddy, it's me. And then the phone just went blank. And for like a day, people's cell phones were ringing with this woman's number, and they would pick it up and there'd be nobody there. And so this was the story. I mean, this is this woman telling me this story as she sits there basically weeping. I don't even know her. And I said to her after she got done, I said, you know, believe it or not, there's a whole book called Phone Calls from the Dead. And people actually have this experience. This is rare, but it's actually not unheard of. And I believe you. I believe this happened. And I have no idea how to explain it or what to say about it, but I just believe you. And that is all she wanted. She just wanted another human being. whom she perceived as a cultural authority, to acknowledge that what happened to her, and that she wasn't lying or making this up or crazy. And I said that to her, and I was very sincere about it. And she listened, and she said, I just want to thank you. And she walked away, and she got in the car and drove back to New York. And I never heard from her again.
Wow.
And so that's, for me, that's kind of a little parable, because I think that's where a lot of people are with these experiences. They're so intimate, and they're often around death and dying or illness or loss. They're not tangential. They're not minor. They're at the very heart of these people's lives. And they're so dispirited that nobody will listen, you know? And so that's kind of what I've set my sights on, is just creating some kind of little subculture that will listen, you know, and not try to explain it, not believe X, Y, or Z about it, which may be right or wrong, who knows, but just to take it seriously. And that makes all the difference, I assure you. And people just go on and on and on and on and on and on.
My dad, he never keeps a diary. He's never written any story down in his life. But when he had his near-death experience, he felt the need to write it down. There was a Christmas where he gave it to all, like the writing down. He handwrote all of them and gave them to each of us, just
See,
for us to fully understand it.
That's significant. I mean, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but there's a Netflix series now called Unsolved Mysteries. And I generally do not like Netflix series, but this one's quite good. And they have an episode on a major UFO flap in 1960. Have you seen this?
Yeah, I love Unsolved. I mean, I grew up on Unsolved Mysteries, so like when Netflix revamped it.
So what I'm thinking of is that guy who does the painting.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like your dad, you know. He was so moved by this experience of being essentially sucked up into a UFO, and that nobody would listen to him, and he paints it, and he just sets that painting, you know, in his office or living room, and it's just kind of a testament to this experience. And that's what I'm talking about, is just, that's it. That's what's important about, at least what I'm interested in. I know that's not what's all important, but that was an effective episode, actually. I thought they handled each of those figures really well, and the people were so down to earth and so blunt about it, and they were so good about talking about how they were silenced, essentially, and how we're 50 years out, and they're talking about it on television for the first time. Yeah. And they couldn't even, as you know, they couldn't even find a police report. They went back, there was no report, there was nothing, because nobody would write about it. Nobody would talk about it.
And there's also this idea that episode lends itself to, that it's kind of, I always want to tell people who don't believe in things like that, you still need to understand that that's a real experience for that person, and that's formed that person's spirituality, that's formed that person's life, of how they interact with the world. Like, it's
the problem with that experience is it wasn't just his experience. There was a woman in the house who watched him get sucked up into nowhere. Right. This is a shared experience. So it kind of just blows to shreds your notion that these are kind of private illusions.
Well, and in the flip, you mentioned that guy who had an alien-like abduction, and so did his daughter, and the daughter's fiance couldn't find her for hours. And
6 hours.
It was all these people just experiencing the same thing.
Yeah, I often say I don't believe in belief. And what I mean by that is, I think belief is the wrong response, because it shuts it down. Once you adopt a belief about some event like this, you've decided what it is, and that's it. You know, so I don't find that productive or persuasive. It's like, no, don't do that. Don't believe. Just put belief aside. I'm not asking you to believe. I'm just asking you to say that this happened, and then let's talk about how it happened and we don't know why, but how does the human person then respond to it or not respond to it? I think we can talk about that. I don't think we can talk about why it happened or how it happened, because I don't think we're capable of that.
Yeah. But it's understanding also the purpose of why it happens, which you mention a lot of looking into what is the purpose of these, like, you know, how do we understand that?
Yeah. Well, a lot of the experiencers, they're just like, I have no idea. And, you know, and some of them are just bizarre. They're just absurd. And they really, really shake these people up. They thought they understood the world, and then no, they don't. So.
There's a really interesting part in your book because the radio example goes through the whole book, and then I can't remember the name of the scientist, but it was he and his wife or fiance were about to get married.
That's Michael Shermer. He's like the most famous skeptic in the whole country.
Yes, that's right. He was a huge skeptic. Yeah.
He edits the magazine called The Skeptic. He writes for Scientific American too. Yeah. He is so honest about that, though. That's what I admired about that piece is he essentially has a paranormal experience, and he basically says, I get it, you know, and the physics of it, I can explain the physics of it, the battery connecting and the radio going on, but I can't explain why it was that song at that time, you know, perfectly timed. He says, that's what's so weird about it. And I was like, okay, Michael, that's it. That's what I'm saying, you know. I'm not.
Yeah, that was such an interesting moment for you to again make your point of when you're in a lab, you can't recreate these things because there's no love there, there's no emotion there. It's just this like blank, like let's get this done. This is research.
The lab is designed to remove all of that. The scientific method is this brilliant method in which you remove everything that's interesting actually and human, and you to create this sort of objective kind of single variable space. But of course, that's not how life works.
Yeah.
And I tell this, you know, the story I always tell is, you know, it's using the scientific method to prove this it's like going to the North Pole to prove the existence of zebras. I mean, there are no zebras on the North Pole, and you can look all you want at the North Pole for zebras, but you ain't gonna find any.
They're not there.
You actually have to go to where zebras live to prove the existence of zebras. Yeah. And it's the same with this stuff. You can't use your method in a controlled laboratory to do it. You have to like go to where this happens and talk to these people. And once you do that, you're like, whoa, you know, that's.
The example so I remember the zebra example. The other example I remember that you used right before the zebra example that really struck me was going out during the day looking for stars. Right. And saying, well, stars don't exist because we're in this circumstance.
Right.
Just totally ignoring that, like, no, they're there. We just can't see them right now because we're not in the right situation for it. I mean, that was a wow moment.
Yeah, the sun is blocking them out.
Yeah.
You can't, they're all there. They haven't moved. They're still but you ain't going to see them, you know. Yeah. You ain't going to prove to me that they're there because clearly they're not. Right?
Of course not. No, I can't see them. That's just blue sky. You mean the clouds? All right. Well, I want to thank you again so much for tonight. This was amazing.
Well, thanks, Kate, for asking me. I enjoy it, and I enjoy talking to people at Rice about it because I sometimes worry that, you know, people think it's too weird, and I'm just trying to make it more normal, and people are fascinated by it. That's what I've learned over and over again. They really, really want to talk about this, and you'll get the typical angry debunker who's like, "Oh, that's a bunch of bullshit," and, you know, "Oh God, don't tell me that." But that's going to be like 0.5% of what the people are. The rest of the people are like, wow, that's interesting. I never thought of that.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I'll never forget. I was interested in near-death experiences and things like that before my dad even had one, and I got to give props to Bill Parsons for that one.
Uh-huh.
But I wrote like a 40-page paper on it. Like it's something that is very, I think all humans, it's hard not to be drawn to those stories and interested in
We're
those.
all going to die.
Yeah.
I mean, why aren't we interested in this?
Yeah.
That's what's kind of weird to me is like, how could you not be interested in dying? I mean,
Yeah.
you're
Totally.
going to die. Everyone around you going to die. You better be interested in this.
Yeah. It's just, it's human nature.
You're a Relly major, Kate.
Through and through.
Yeah, you've already been initiated into the mysteries, so we don't have to convince you.
Exactly. But all right. Well, thank you again so much. I can't wait to have you back. I'm sure I'm going to have you on a podcast soon because we clearly have a lot to talk about. And thank you to we still have 44 participants still listening. So thank you to all of y'all for still listening.
I'm sorry we didn't get to the questions or enough of the questions. That's always the case. You never get to the questions.
It always is. There's just never enough time. But we will see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
All right, thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.